And on Sports Central, we go over our next schedule preview this offseason, and it's going to be for the Miami Hurricanes, team that went 7-5 overall in the 2021 season. And this team had some high expectations going into 2021, especially with the amount of returning talent that they had going into the season. So it makes sense why. I mean, Miami was expected to be such a good team last year. Turns out this team dealt with a few major injuries, and that definitely made a big difference in this team's outcome of the 2021 season. But how will they be in 2022? That's what we'll be going over here today. We'll be going over the players this team will be losing, who they'll be returning, and also looking at their schedule for the first time this offseason, starting out with your notable games from last year. And this team 7-5 overall. Lost to Miami, or lost to Alabama, 13-44 in week 1. Obviously, I mean, Alabama, that's a tough way to begin the season there against the number 1 ranked team in the nation at the time there in the Crimson Tide. And, of course, Miami didn't turn out so well, lost to them 13-44. Kept it close against the Tar Heels of North Carolina. Ended up taking the loss there by 3 on the road, but it was very close and high scoring. Beat NC State by 1. That was a big win. Beat Pitt as well on the road, 30-34. So they kind of went on a good, after that North Carolina game, this team got a couple of big wins there against some of the best teams in the conference there with NC State and Pitt. They beat Virginia Tech 38-26 and beat Duke to finish out the season 47-10. And I mean, this team, they had some good performances last year. I mean, this team definitely showed their potential at many points in the season, but they were a bit inconsistent, and the injuries, they did make a difference for sure for this team last year. They were 2-4 in their first 6 games, which was obviously a shock. I mean, this team, having been expected, I mean, I had some pretty high expectations for them. D'Eriq King coming back, the amount of talent around him coming back, and the defense. I mean, it looked really good for the Hurricanes going into last season. Turns out it wasn't. I mean, 7-5 is still not a terrible record, but certainly it should have been better for this team. But they were 5-1 in their last 6. So on the bright side, this team did play very well in their last 6 games. They got accepted. Obviously, they were in a bowl game, but that game ended up getting canceled. Or Miami got pulled out because of COVID issues, unfortunately, for the Hurricanes. Here's your roster preview going into next season. This team does return the top quarterback, Tyler Van Dyke. We saw D'Eriq King play for a little while, but it turns out Tyler Van Dyke was the primary starter for most of the season. He put up 2,900 yards, 25 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and a 62% completion rate. So when he caught on, I mean, Tyler Van Dyke actually played pretty well. I mean, his touchdown interception ratio, 25-6, is pretty good. 2,900 yards, 62% completion rate. Those aren't terrible stats. And considering how young he is, I mean, he definitely, I think, shows potential going into the future. And I'm looking forward to seeing how he does going into next season. But, of course, D'Eriq King, he's gone. He threw for 700 yards when he did play, 3 touchdowns, 4 picks. So when he did play, it was obviously tough on him. He didn't really, he threw more picks than touchdowns when he did play last season. So that was kind of a disappointment. But, I mean, if you look at D'Eriq King, he had a great 2020 season. I mean, there were so many reasons to believe that he was going to lead this team to a really good season in 2021. But it kind of turned out the opposite direction. Jalen Knighton, your top running back from last year, is coming back. Put up 800 yards, 11 touchdowns. That's a good return there. You got Cameron Harris, who's gone. Your second back from last season. He put up 520 yards and 6 touchdowns. So it's good to have Knighton back. He'll definitely be a big impact player next season. You lose your top 2 receivers, though. Charleston Rambo, the top one from last year, put up 1,100 yards, 7 touchdowns. Yeah, that'll be a tough loss there. And then you also lose Mike Harley, who was your second receiver last season. 500 yards, 5 touchdowns is what he had. So receiving core does lose a couple of key players there. You got your third receiver coming back, though, and your tight end and fourth in receiving on the team there in Mallory. So, I mean, you do have some good depth in that receiving position. I'm not too terribly concerned about that there. Of course, I mean, there's a few question marks. Otherwise, on the defense, you lose 3 defensive linemen, which is going to be tough. Linebacker Carter, and then your safety in Bolden, along with 2 on the offensive line. So you do have a few to replace there on the offensive line and defensive line for sure. And that does concern me a little bit going into next season. So you do see a moderate amount of losses. This team will be a bit younger next season, but how high is the ceiling for this team going into next year? I mean, especially considering, there's no lying here, as this team was a bit of a disappointment last season. But what does that show for next season? Will this team improve? How will they be? The ceiling, I feel like, for this team remains decently high. I feel like this team definitely, Tyler Van Dyke, he He's shown his potential. He's still a young quarterback with potential. So, I mean, we'll see how he does. And I feel like this team does return enough talent to the point where they could be a contender in the ACC. It's just a matter of if they can close out those big games. And, of course, the inconsistency was kind of an issue last season for this team. But the ceiling, I feel like, is still pretty high for this team. They definitely show potential. And, yeah, once again, this is a very interesting team. Really looking forward to seeing how they do. Transfer portal and recruiting going into next season. This team, of course, is, and they have been, extremely active in the transfer portal. Multiple things have happened, and significant ones. You got Moultrie, an edge rusher coming in from UAB. That's a big addition. You got a defensive lineman coming in from UCLA there. You got a defensive back, Porter, coming in from West Virginia. You got Parrish, a running back from Ole Miss, coming in. You got a receiver in Ladson. That'll add to the depth in the receiving core there. And then you got a couple of players leaving, like Hall, of course, going to Utah State. You got Jennings, who's off to Indiana, linebacker there. And then you got also Nesta Jade Silvera, who's going to be off to Arizona State. That'll be a tough loss there. So we'll see what happens for Miami. This team does lose a couple of key players, but they also gain several players, which could be definitely impacts on this team. Recruiting-wise, this team looks great, 15th in the nation, 3rd in the ACC. They got 10 4-stars coming in and then 4 3-stars. So recruiting and transfer portal-wise, I mean, this team doesn't look terrible. You're losing a few players, but recruiting-wise, it looks pretty good, and the transfer portal in general looks pretty good as well. But that said, let's look at your schedule now going into next season and start off the season against FCS Bethune-Cookman on the 3rd of September. Then you got Southern Miss coming to town the 10th. Then you got a tough one on the road in Texas A&M in College Station. That'll be a fun matchup there. That'll be a challenge for the Hurricanes there. And they're playing Middle Tennessee on the 24th at home. North Carolina's at home. Then Virginia Tech on the road. Duke at home. Virginia on the road to end off your October. And then in November, you got Florida State at home. Georgia Tech, Clemson on their own. Then Pitt at home to finish out the season. Look at your first half of your schedule. Bethune-Cookman, easy win. Southern Miss, easy win. Both of those Hurricanes should control. Southern Miss was 3-9 last year. They're not very good. They probably won't be next year again. And then Bethune-Cookman, obviously FCS teams. So not too concerned about the first 2 games. But Texas A&M on the road, that is a game where you're playing them in week 3. The Aggies being at home in that matchup, I could see them. I mean, if anyone's going to beat Alabama in that SEC West, it's going to be Texas A&M. I mean, if you look at that division, I mean, the Aggies and how the Aggies look going into next season, I mean, yeah, Texas A&M is going to be good going into next season. So I'm going to favor them in that matchup decently. I'm pretty confident that Texas A&M does win that game, but then you got Middle Tennessee at home on the 24th. Put that game in yellow, but I'm definitely going to favor the Hurricanes there. North Carolina, Virginia Tech, both those games are pretty much coin tosses. I'm going to favor both those teams, though, barely in each of those matchups. That North Carolina game especially, being at home for the Hurricanes, I could see that one going either way. Now for the second half of your schedule, you got Duke coming up on the 22nd. That is a home game there. I'm going to favor the Hurricanes there. And I'm pretty confident Miami wins that game. Not too concerned about Duke going into next season. You got Virginia on the road on the 29th, and this team kind of in a phase where they're still trying to rebuild, get back to a place where they can be a major contender in the ACC. I feel like this team does take a couple of, and the inconsistency has been an issue in the past. I think they'll take a couple of confusing losses potentially this season, and Virginia might be one of them. I mean, even Virginia, though, that team, they should be okay. I mean, they should still be good next season. I mean, I'd be very surprised if the Cavaliers didn't make it to a bowl game next year. So, and I mean, if you make it to a bowl game, you're at least you got to be a decent football team. So, I'll favor the Cavaliers in that game barely, but it's obviously close. Florida State, I'll favor the Hurricanes there. Same thing with Georgia Tech. Both games are in yellow. So I do think both games will be somewhat close. Georgia Tech with it being on the road, that's why I'm putting that game in yellow, but still favoring the Hurricanes. I'd say I'm pretty confident Miami's going to beat Georgia Tech, but potentially it'll be a bit closer than, say, if I were to put a game in green. And then Clemson on the road, Tigers should be better next season. Wouldn't be surprised if Clemson went on to win the ACC yet again next season. They are returning quite a bit of talent. They'll be more experienced next year, so I'll favor Clemson there on the road. And then Pitt should fall off a little bit with the amount of talent they're losing. Kenny Pickett obviously is the most significant of those losses, and so yeah, I do expect Pitt to fall off just a little bit next season, but that said, I'll take Miami in that game in a close one. Record projection 5-7 and 9-3 for this team. Honestly, the floor could be 6-6 for this team. I do think the ceiling, though, 9 wins is pretty reasonable. I feel like this team's still kind of in a rebuilding phase. I feel like next year could be once again in that 7-8 win range. That's definitely the most reasonable if you ask me, but I mean, we'll see what happens. I mean, this team is a tougher one to predict because of those inconsistencies, and I mean, they were kind of a disappointment last year, so you never know what's going to happen going into 2022. But I'll go 5-7 and 9-3 for this team, and I feel like that 7-8 win range once again is very reasonable for this team. But let me know your thoughts and comments below on this team, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.